Good afternoon. I'm Ando. I teach architecture in Tokyo, Japan. I would like to talk about studying on forms of city centers in Japan. It is an analysis of cityscapes and a method to generate cityscapes by using algorithmic calculation of computer graphics. This is a view of Tokyo. Tokyo is the capital of Japan. It conforms to a population area of over 30 million with surrounding cities. In the world, there are various cityscapes, which are configured by three-dimensional volumes of buildings. For example, this is a view of Chicago, Dubai, United Arab Emirates. I think each city center has unique image of its cityscape. In Georgetown, in Penang Island, Malaysia, we can see a cityscape formed by arrangements of low-rise shop houses. In Europe, for example, Brasov in Romania, aesthetic streetscapes are formed by buildings that face streets and plazas. This is a view of Paris, France. Most of the buildings, except the Eiffel Tower, heights are unified and the buildings are lined up along the street. This is Shibuya, one of multiple city centers in Tokyo. Comparing with Paris, this streetscape is apparently disorder. In Japan, most of buildings are detached from the adjacent buildings, and heights are not unified. In spite of that, this area is highly condensed. Small buildings are sandwiched by middle or large buildings. In Japanese cities, especially in the multiple city centers in Tokyo, there is a diverse distribution of buildings. In particular, the heights of the buildings are quite diverse. Low-rise and mid to high-rise buildings are densely and randomly crowded together. The first objective of this study is to find out the characteristics of form compositions of city centers by analyzing the accumulation of building volumes. Over these 20 years, I have surveyed the configuration of 5 city centers in Tokyo, Japan, such as Asakusa, Ginza, Shibuya, Shinjuku, and Ikebukuro. These are typical city centers where buildings accumulate at high density. Before starting the analysis, I would like to explain how these 3D models are created. In Japan, plane forms of landforms, roads, waters, buildings, and so on are digitized in the numerical maps issued by the government. This is an example of the map data. The map data contains the planar forms of buildings. I use QGIS, a geographical information system application, to convert the map data to geometrical CAD data. There is one thing I have to point out, that the building heights are not digitized on the government maps. So, I needed to use a commercially available map to get to know the building heights. I used Zenring residential map, which the number of floors that explained the building heights is described. In cooperation with my students, we gave the building heights one by one, 3.5 meter for each floor, for the plane shapes while referring to the residential maps. Now, I would like to talk about the form composition of the city centers. By using a CAD application, we can calculate the floor numbers and the areas of the building volumes from the 5 3D models. There are 12,977 buildings with 1 to 60 floors. The graph shows the distribution of the number and the floor areas of the buildings, respectively by their floor number. For example, in Shibuya, which is a model of 8 towns in about 1 square kilometer around the Shibuya train and metro station, there are 182 city blocks, 2,040 buildings with floors between 1 to 34, and they have various building areas. This is the distribution of the number and the floor areas of the buildings in Shibuya. We can see that there are many low-rise buildings even in this high-density city center. When the 2040 buildings are classified into 6 categories according to their building area, there are 410 extra small buildings, of which buildings areas are less than 50 square meters. The number is 20% of the total buildings. Their average floor number is 3.2 stories, and their deviation is 1.7 stories. The percentage of the small buildings, which buildings area are between 50 to 100 square meter, is 29%. The average floor number is 4.6. The deviation is 2.5. 24% is the middle-sized buildings, which buildings area are between 100 to 200 square meter. The average floor number is 5.7. The deviation is 2.7. 60% is the large-sized buildings, which building areas are between 200 to 500 square meter. The average floor number is 6.8. The deviation is 3.0. 10% is the extra-large buildings, which buildings areas are between 500 to 2,000 square meter. The average floor number is 8.5. The deviation is 4.7. There are 18 buildings which have very, very large building areas over 2,000 square meters, such as railway stations and large-scale complex buildings. Its percentage is 0.9%. Each city center has its unique form, and its characteristics are considered to be represented by the accumulation of building volumes. In Ikebukuro, like Shibuya, several skyscrapers stand out among wide ranges of middle-rise buildings, and there are partial areas where low-rise buildings are gathered. Although there are a number of small buildings in Ginza, the building coverage rate and the floor area rate is relatively high. In Asakusa, low-rise and middle-rise buildings are condensed. In Shinjuku, the contrast between the skyscraper areas on the west side and the middle-rise buildings on the east side is distinctive. The second objective of this study is to generate the forms of the city centers by calculation based on the analysis result. The left-hand side is a model with actual building heights, and the right-hand side is the automatic generated cityscape of Asakusa. Giving the building heights to the planar shapes one by one manually is a tiresome work, but if we could predict the height, the cityscape would be created automatically. For the preliminary study, I attempted an automatic generation of the city centers of Asakusa. I took a hypothesis that the building heights distribution follows a normal distribution, not a homogeneous distribution or a uniformed random distribution. I categorized 2,068 total buildings into 3 groups based on buildings areas less than 50 square meter as small, 50 to 200 square meter as middle, and over 200 square meters as large. For the large-sized buildings with over 200 square meter area, the average floor number was 7.0. With the amendment, I considered the average height of this group is 31.5 meter, and the deviation is 40 meter. The screen showed the shapes of the large buildings. Then, the building heights are given according to the normal probability distribution of the means and deviations of each group. This is a script which generates heights with a normal distribution. The height with the average of 31.5 meter and the deviation of 40 meter are generated. So, this is a result of generating heights of the large buildings. Same method is applied to the middle buildings with the average height of 70.5 meters and the deviation of 7 meter. The gray volumes are the generated middle-sized buildings. I use the average height of 10.5 meter and the deviation of 3.5 meter for the small buildings. The pink volumes are the small-sized buildings. Again, this is the result of the automatic generation of the Asakusa city center. After trial and error to apply this method to other city centers, I noticed that it is effective to classify the buildings into 6 groups: extra small, small, middle, large, extra large, and super large, according to their building area. For example, in Shibuya, at first, I extracted the small buildings, of which areas are less than 50 square meter. Then the heights are given according to the normal distribution with their average and deviation. Small-sized buildings with 50 to 100 square meter building areas. Middle-sized buildings with 100 to 200 square meter building areas. Large-sized buildings with 200 to 500 square meter. Extra large-sized buildings with 500 to 2000 square meter building area. There are 18 super large buildings, of which buildings area exceed 2000 square meters, such as railway stations and department stores complex or some large-scale complex in Shibuya. And there are also high-rise buildings with over 20 floors. I noticed that they should be regarded as peculiar elements, and the automatic calculation should not be applied. For 99% of the whole buildings, except the super large and the high-rise buildings, as 1%, their heights are generated by algorithm. This is the actual cityscape. I think these are same. Can you tell the difference? This is short animation of viewing the generated model. In this animation, the super large buildings and skyscrapers and landmarks are colored in red, as they were excluded from the automatic generations. Of course, in detail, this is different from the actual model, but I think the image of the cityscape could be represented. This is the generated model of Ginza. At the conclusion, the form of the city centers could be represented by using normal distribution based on the height, average, and deviations. I consider that the distribution of heights are unique with respect to each city centers, and it should be the characteristics of the cityscapes. Thank you for your attention.